year 1874 was not kind to the verdant hills of Tennessee. A thick, oppressive heat had settled over the land, baking the clay-rich soil into a cracked, brittle surface. In Nashville, where progress was a whispered promise of gas lamps and electric marvels yet to come, Dr. Alistair Finch felt the weight of the summer air as a physical presence. A man of science, a psychiatrist whose reputation was built on unraveling the intricate puzzles of the human mind. He was an anomaly in a time when most maladies of the spirit were attributed to God's will or the devil's curse. His latest summons, however, was a case that even his colleagues, men of reason, spoke of with a palpable shudder. The letter, delivered by a young, gaunt man who refused to meet his eyes, was brief and to the point. It was from the town elder of Blackwood Creek, a remote community nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The Millers, a family known for their piety and prosperity, were afflicted. The letter used a word Alistair despised, a word that belonged in the sermons of fire and brimstone preachers, not in the case files of a medical professional. Possession. Alistair, a man who saw the supernatural as a crutch for the ignorant, a convenient excuse for behaviors they couldn't comprehend, felt a surge of professional curiosity. This was not a case of a single hysteric, but an entire family. His reputation was at stake. If he could prove this was a psychological phenomenon, his theories on the mind would be validated on a grander scale. The journey to Blackwood Creek was a test of endurance. The carriage jostled violently over rutted dirt roads, the forests on either side growing thicker and more foreboding with every mile. The air changed, losing its urban dust and acquiring the scent of damp earth, pine, and something else, a faint metallic smell that reminded Alistair of blood and rust. He arrived in the late afternoon. Blackwood Creek was less a town and more a collection of weathered shacks and a single imposing stone church. The silence was unnerving. There were no children playing in the street, no men whittling on porches. The few faces he saw were drawn and pale, their eyes filled with a fear that transcended simple unease. Elder Thomas, a man whose face was a roadmap of worry lines, met him at the edge of the town square. He was tall, thin, and had a nervous habit of wringing his hands. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper, "thank you for coming. We feared you would not." "I am a man of my word, Elder," Alistair replied, his tone professional and calm, a stark contrast to the surrounding anxiety. "Where are the Millers?" "In their home. It's not a place you would want to be after dark," the elder warned. "The family, they've changed." Alistair ignored the superstitious overtones. He was here to observe, to diagnose. The Miller homestead was a short walk from the center of town. It was a beautiful two-story farmhouse, the kind that spoke of hard work and honest living. But as they approached, a sense of profound wrongness settled over Alistair. The windows were shuttered, as if the house were trying to hide from the sun. An eerie silence emanated from within. Elder Thomas led him to the front door, his hand trembling as he raised it to knock. The sound echoed in the stillness. After a long moment, the door creaked open just enough for a gaunt, terrified face to peer out. It was Sarah Miller, the matriarch. Her eyes, once rumored to be the color of the summer sky, were now the dull gray of a stormy day. "Elder, what do you want?" she whispered, her voice strained. "I've brought the doctor, Sarah, from Nashville," Elder Thomas said, his voice a mixture of pity and fear. Sarah's eyes flickered to Alistair. For a brief second, a flicker of hope crossed her face, quickly replaced by a profound and chilling emptiness. She swung the door open, her arm moving with a mechanical stiffness. "He can come in," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The air inside the house was thick and stale, smelling of unwashed bodies and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet. It was the smell of rot, of something dying slowly. Alistair's professional training kicked in. He had to be dispassionate, a neutral observer. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He saw the family gathered in the living room, sitting on the edges of their chairs as if ready to flee at any moment. The father, a large, once robust man named Elias, sat slumped in his chair, his head lolling to one side. His eyes were wide and vacant. His two sons, Jacob and Thomas, were huddled in a corner, their movements jerky and unnatural. His daughter Eliza, the youngest, sat in the center of the room, staring at the floor, her small body convulsing with a series of silent, violent tremors. Alistair felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This was not the behavior of simple hysteria. This was something far more complex, something that defied easy categorization. He had seen catatonia, psychosis, 1,000 different shades of mental anguish, but never anything like this. Their stillness was the stillness of a predator waiting to strike. Their eyes, when they met his, were devoid of any recognizable human emotion. They were empty. "Sarah," Alistair said softly, addressing the mother, "can you tell me what happened? When did this begin?" She didn't look at him. She stared at a point just over his shoulder, her eyes fixed on some unseen terror. "The sounds," she whispered. "The sounds started first." "What sounds?" Alistair pressed. "The scratching from inside the walls. And the whispers. They never stop." She raised her hands to her ears, a gesture of futile desperation. "They never stop." Alistair felt a prickle of unease. He had a theory, a purely psychological one, but he needed to be cautious. He needed to understand the environment, the family dynamics, the events that led to this. "I'm going to need to speak to each of you individually," he said, trying to project an air of calm confidence he didn't entirely feel. A strange guttural noise erupted from Elias, the father. It was a sound that was not human, a deep, rattling noise that seemed to claw its way up from his throat. His head snapped up, his vacant eyes locking onto Alistair's. A slow, thin smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a stranger, a smile without warmth or light. Alistair instinctively took a step back, the hairs on his arms standing on end. He had a fleeting, irrational thought that this was not a man smiling at him, but something else entirely. Elder Thomas, seeing the doctor's unease, quickly grabbed his arm. "We should leave them for the night, Doctor. It's safer." Alistair, despite his skepticism, felt the wisdom in the elder's words. The atmosphere was too charged, too volatile. He needed to process what he had just seen. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at the family. Eliza, the young girl, had stopped her tremors. She raised her head. Her eyes, once filled with childish innocence, now held a terrifying, knowing look. She mouthed a single word to him. "Run." Alistair felt a jolt of ice-cold fear shoot through him. This was not a plea. It was a warning. As they left the house, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a bruised palette of purple and orange. The shadows lengthened, twisting and warping the familiar landscape of Blackwood Creek into a world of menacing shapes and forms. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper that seemed to come from the Miller house itself. Alistair couldn't make out the words, but the chilling tone was unmistakable. He had come here to prove the power of the mind. Now, as the darkness of Blackwood Creek enveloped him, he had the terrifying feeling that something was proving its own power over him, a power he was not prepared to face. If you're captivated by the mystery of the Miller family, you can find the rest of this terrifying story by subscribing to the channel. Don't miss a single chapter of this chilling tale. This is a work of fiction. Alistair spent the night in a small, cramped room at the back of Elder Thomas's church. Sleep was a luxury his mind refused to grant. The image of the Miller family, their empty eyes and unnatural stillness, replayed in his thoughts like a macabre and broken film. The little girl's warning, "Run," echoed in the silence of the night, a chilling reminder that his scientific detachment was a fragile shield. In the morning, the air was still and heavy, promising another sweltering day. Alistair met Elder Thomas for a sparse breakfast of stale bread and weak coffee. "They're not well, Doctor," the elder said, as if stating the obvious. "The whole town knows it. But what can you do? God's will is not for us to question." Alistair's patience, already thin, snapped. "With all due respect, Elder, this is not a matter of God's will. It's a matter of the human mind. I need to understand what happened. From the beginning. What changed?" Elder Thomas sighed, stirring his coffee with a spoon. "It started about a month ago. Small things at first. Elias started becoming withdrawn, not speaking to anyone. Then Sarah, she began to have fits, screaming in the night. The boys, they stopped playing, and Eliza, she was the worst, the screaming." "What did they say when they screamed?" Alistair asked, leaning forward, his professional curiosity overriding his unease. "Nothing intelligible," the elder replied, shaking his head. "Just pure terror." But then came the whispers. Whispers from inside their house. People walking by at night said they could hear it. A constant low murmuring, not one voice but many. And it drove them inside. They locked the doors and sealed the windows. They haven't left since. Alistair listened, his mind working furiously. The symptoms pointed to a form of collective hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by extreme stress. But what was the source? He pressed the elder for more information about the Miller family's history, their recent lives. "They were a good family," the elder insisted. "Hard-working. Elias was a carpenter, and a fine one at that. They were well off. They recently bought a new plot of land a few miles out near the old Smith farm. They were going to build a new barn." Alistair's mind latched onto this detail. A new farm, new surroundings, a new source of stress. "Tell me about the old Smith farm," he said. The elder's face clouded. "It's a strange place. The Smiths left it years ago. No one knows why. The well is, well, it's supposed to be cursed." Alistair scoffed internally. Cursed was a word he associated with folklore, not reality. But he was here to understand the Miller family's reality, however skewed. He decided to visit the old farm. It was the only new variable he had. He reasoned that some environmental factor, a noxious gas or some kind of toxin in the soil, could be affecting the family. The path to the old Smith farm was overgrown and little used. The air grew still, the oppressive heat intensifying. He found the abandoned homestead easily. The house was a dilapidated ruin, its porch caved in and windows shattered. But it was the well that drew his attention. It was old, built of heavy, moss-covered stones. A thick, rusted chain dangled over the lip, disappearing into the dark, unknown depths below. Alistair knelt, peering into the well. The air that rose from it was colder than the surrounding atmosphere, and it carried a faint, musty smell. The smell of decay. He dropped a small stone he had picked up, listening for the splash. It came a long time later, a faint sound swallowed by the cavernous darkness. As he stood up, he noticed something in the dirt near the well's edge. A small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was not a child's toy, it was too intricate, too specific. He picked it up. The carving was precise, and the wood was dark and smooth from years of handling. He turned it over in his hand, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. It looked ancient. He returned to town, the small bird clutched in his pocket. He decided to pay a second visit to the Millers, this time with a more focused agenda. He needed to get them to talk. He found them in the same positions, the eerie silence of the house broken only by the low, continuous hum of the flies buzzing at the window panes. He sat down opposite Elias, the father. "Elias," he said, his voice low and calm. "I want you to listen to me. I'm here to help." Elias said nothing, his eyes fixed on the opposite wall. But then a subtle change. His left hand, resting on his knee, began to twitch. The twitching grew more pronounced, a rhythmic, jerking motion that seemed to have a life of its own. Alistair watched, his professional curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread. He pulled the wooden bird from his pocket. "I found this at the old Smith farm, near the well. Do you know what this is?" The moment he said the words, Elias's body went rigid. The twitching stopped. He turned his head slowly, his eyes, once vacant, now filled with a flash of raw, unfiltered fear. He opened his mouth and a sound came out. Not the guttural noise from before, but a low, terrified whisper. The words. He said the words. Alistair's mind raced. What words? Who was he? The family was not merely experiencing a shared delusion, they were sharing a secret, a trauma. He needed to find the key. "Elias, what words? Who are you talking about?" Suddenly the boy, Jacob, erupted from his corner. He scrambled to his father's side, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "Don't listen to him, Papa. He'll make it worse." The other son, Thomas, and the mother, Sarah, were also stirring. The atmosphere in the room shifted, growing thick with a palpable tension. The family was a coiled spring, ready to snap. Alistair felt a moment of pure, unadulterated fear. He had pushed too far, too fast. He was no longer a doctor in a controlled environment. He was a man trapped in a room with a family on the brink of a terrifying breakdown. Alistair retreated from the Miller house, the chilling tension of the encounter lingering like a bad taste in his mouth. He had been close. He was sure of it. The mention of the well and the words had triggered a reaction far more powerful than simple stress. It was a reaction to a specific memory, a shared event that had broken the family's fragile psyche. He knew he had to dig deeper, to find the source of this trauma before he could even begin to heal it. His next stop was the town mill, a creaky, water-powered structure that stood on the banks of a slow-moving river. It was there that he found Caleb, the Miller family's longtime hired hand. Caleb was a gruff, laconic man with a face weathered by sun and toil. He had worked for the Millers for over a decade. Alistair approached him with caution. "I'm the doctor from Nashville. I'm here about the Millers." Caleb's eyes, the color of a stormy sea, flickered with suspicion. He wiped a hand on his dusty overalls. "Folks say they're sick. Don't know what to tell you." "They're not just sick, Caleb," Alistair said, his voice firm but not accusatory. "They're terrified. I believe it has something to do with the old Smith farm, the well." Caleb's hands stilled. He looked up at Alistair, a haunted look in his eyes. "You shouldn't be poking around there, Doctor." "Why not?" Caleb sighed, leaned against a dusty sack of grain, and finally spoke. "The Miller family, they were getting greedy. Elias, he had his sights set on building the biggest barn in the county. He needed more land. The old Smith place was cheap, too cheap." "What did they find?" Alistair asked, his heart beginning to pound. "Not what, but who," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "Old man Smith. He was found at the bottom of the well. His body, rotted and bloated. Nobody knew he was even missing. The Millers, they found him while they were scouting the land. But they didn't report it." Alistair's mind reeled, the smell of decay at the well. It all made sense. Why didn't they report it? Caleb's eyes scanned the empty mill, as if making sure they were alone. Elias and his father, they always had a feud over that land. Elias wanted to buy it, but his father, old man Thomas, always said it was cursed. He said there was an old legend about the well, about a man who drowned in it and cursed the land. Elias, he didn't believe in such things. He wanted that land for himself. But when they found the body, they were scared. They thought they'd be blamed. They just covered it up. The story was beginning to take a sinister turn. This wasn't a family suffering from a supernatural affliction. This was a family suffering from a terrible shared guilt. The possession was the weight of their secret, and the whispers were the echoes of their own consciences. The scratching in the walls. It was likely rodents, a mundane explanation for a terrifying sound. Alistair felt a jolt of exhilaration. This was it. The root of the problem was a crime, not a curse. "Where is the body now?" Alistair asked. "They moved it," Caleb said, his voice barely audible. "Buried it on the new land, near the old well. I helped them." Alistair felt a surge of professional duty, but also a moral and ethical dilemma. He was a doctor, not a detective. But he knew that to truly help the Millers, he had to confront the source of their trauma. He had to uncover the truth. He left the mill and headed back toward the Miller homestead. He decided he would approach them not as a doctor, but as a confidant. He would let them know he knew the truth, and he would show them that the only way to heal was to confess. He felt a grim satisfaction. This was the true nature of their possession. Not a demonic force, but a psychological one, rooted in a terrible human act. He arrived at the house. This time, he didn't knock. He simply opened the door. The air inside was still thick with the oppressive stench of decay, but now he knew where it came from. The family was still in the living room, but they were in different positions. They were huddled together on the floor, their hands over their ears. A low, mournful moaning came from Elias. "Elias," Alistair said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I know about the well, and I know about the body." The moaning stopped. Elias looked up, his eyes wide and full of panic. The children looked at their father, then at Alistair. They were like a pack of frightened animals. "He found it," Eliza whispered. "He knows the words." "What words?" Alistair pressed. "The words he said when he fell," Eliza whispered, her eyes fixed on something Alistair couldn't see. "The last words." Alistair felt a shiver run down his spine. The old man hadn't just died. He had said something, a dying curse. Alistair scoffed at the thought. A dying man's words were a symptom of his agony, not a magical incantation. But to the Millers, superstitious and guilty, it would be all the proof they needed. He said, "You will always be with me. Every one of you." Eliza whispered. Alistair's heart sank. He had thought he had the answer, the logical, scientific explanation, but this added a new, terrifying layer. A curse was not real, but the belief in a curse, when combined with a guilty conscience, could be a powerful, destructive force. "You're not possessed," Alistair said, his voice urgent, pleading. "You're suffering from guilt. You need to tell the town what you did. It's the only way to heal." Elias began to rock back and forth, a low moan escaping his lips. "It's too late," he whispered. "It's already inside us." Suddenly, a violent spasm shook Elias's body. He convulsed, his limbs flailing, his head snapping back. His eyes rolled up into his head, and a thin line of foamy saliva appeared at the corner of his mouth. The family watched in silent horror. This was not a panic attack. This was something else. Alistair's medical training told him this was a seizure, but the context was all wrong. The other family members began to twitch as well, a horrifying, synchronized dance of terror. Alistair, for the first time since he arrived, felt a genuine, bone-deep fear. He had been so sure of his rational explanation, but what he was witnessing defied everything he knew about the human mind. The possession was a shared, physical symptom, not a psychological one. And as the family writhed on the floor in a shared seizure, Alistair knew that the curse was not an old man's final words, but something far more insidious. Something that was rooted in the very land they had bought with such greed. The scene in the Miller household had been so disturbing that Alistair had to retreat. He knew now that he was no longer dealing with a simple psychological case. The family's shared seizures, their synchronized terror, pointed to a deeper, more frightening truth. He was at a crossroads. He could leave, declaring the case beyond his professional expertise, or he could press on, seeking the true source of this affliction. His professional pride and a growing sense of personal dread urged him to continue. He returned to the mill, but Caleb was gone. He looked for other townsfolk, but they avoided him, their faces a mixture of fear and suspicion. They saw him as an outsider, a harbinger of more bad news. He knew he had to find another source of information. He needed to find someone who had known Old Man Smith. He remembered Elder Thomas mentioning that Old Man Smith was a loner, a man who kept to himself. But even a hermit leaves traces. Alistair's mind went back to the old Smith farm, the dilapidated house. He decided to search it again, more thoroughly this time. He believed that the key to understanding the curse lay not in a supernatural explanation, but in a very real, very human one. The house was a wreck, but as a man of science, Alistair knew that even in a ruin, there is a story. He scoured the dusty, rotting rooms. He found broken furniture, moldy clothes, and a thick layer of dust over everything. He was about to give up when he noticed a loose floorboard in what was once the master bedroom. He knelt, his fingers prying at the wood. It gave way with a groan of protest, revealing a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary. The handwriting was neat, elegant, and old-fashioned. It was Old Man Smith's. Alistair, his hands trembling with anticipation, began to read. The entries were a chronicle of a lonely, paranoid man. Smith wrote about his garden, the change of seasons, and his growing fear of the townspeople. He wrote of his love for his land, especially the well. He believed it had healing properties, that the water was special. But the most recent entries were the most chilling. Smith wrote of a growing feud with the Miller family. He described their arrogance, their relentless desire for his land. He wrote of Elias's visits, his condescending offers, his veiled threats. But the final entries were not about the Millers. They were about the well. There is a presence here, a sound from the depths. It calls to me. It is a song, a low hum that vibrates in my bones. It's not of this world, but it is real. I feel it. I think I'm not alone. Alistair's blood ran cold. This was not the raving of a madman. This was the description of an external, auditory stimulus. What was he hearing? And more importantly, what was it doing to him? The final entry was dated the day before his body was found. They came back, Elias and his sons. They told me to get off my land. They mocked me, laughed at my warnings. They said I was a mad old man. They don't know. They don't know what's waiting for them. The sound is growing stronger. It's in the water now. They will not take this land. They will not take what is mine. It will stay here, with them, and with me, forever. Alistair closed the diary, his hands shaking. This was not a curse. This was the threat of a man who had gone insane, a man who had decided to take a terrible final action. He was no longer looking for a cause of a shared psychosis. He was looking for the cause of a shared poisoning, the water, the well water. That was the answer. He rushed back to Blackwood Creek, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. Old Man Smith, in his paranoid state, could have poisoned the well. He could have used some slow-acting neurotoxic agent. When the Millers took the land, they would have used the well. The strange smell, the bizarre behavior, the shared physical symptoms. It all fit. Old Man Smith had not cursed the family, he had poisoned them. He had created a living curse, a slow-acting form of revenge that would destroy them from the inside out. He found Elder Thomas in his church, praying. Alistair approached him, the diary in his hand. "I know what happened," he said, his voice urgent. "It's not a possession, it's a poisoning. Old man Smith poisoned the well." Elder Thomas looked at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Poison? That's madness, Doctor." "It's not madness," Alistair insisted, his voice rising in frustration. "It's science, the diary. He wrote about it. He planned it." Suddenly, two of the town's deacons, burly men with hard faces, appeared from the shadows of the church. "Elder, what's all this about?" one of them asked, his eyes on Alistair. Elder Thomas's face hardened. "The doctor has been making some strange accusations of murder." Alistair felt a jolt of alarm. He had been so focused on the scientific solution that he had failed to see the political and social one. The Millers were a respected family. The town would not tolerate an accusation of murder. The elder, despite his apparent concern for the Millers, was more concerned with the reputation of his community. "I'm not accusing them of murder," Alistair said, trying to backtrack. "I'm saying they were victims of a different kind of crime. Old man Smith poisoned them. The well water is toxic." The deacons exchanged a look. "You're saying this family is sick because of a well? That sounds like a story to cover up something else." Alistair knew he was losing. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a tidy explanation, a supernatural one they could blame on the devil, and then move on. His rational explanation was an inconvenience, a threat to their community's fragile sense of order. "I need to test the water," Alistair said, his voice firm, "and I need to get the Millers out of there. They are getting worse." "They're not going anywhere, Doctor," the elder said, his voice cold and final. "We will pray for them. Their fate is in God's hands now. You have done what you came here to do. You have given your diagnosis. Now you must leave." Alistair felt a surge of pure frustration. He had found the truth and they were rejecting it. He had to act. He had to save the Millers, even if they wouldn't help themselves. He knew he couldn't leave. He wouldn't. He looked at the faces of the elder and the deacons, and he realized with a chilling certainty that the Millers were not the only ones possessed by their secrets. This entire town was. The secret was the family's guilt, the town's collective blindness, and his own moral conviction. And it was all coming to a terrifying climax. If you're captivated by the mystery of the Miller family, you can find the rest of this terrifying story by subscribing to the channel. Don't miss a single chapter of this chilling tale. This is a work of fiction. Alistair was now an enemy in a town that had once welcomed him. He knew he had to act fast. He couldn't rely on Elder Thomas or the townspeople. He had to save the Millers himself. The poisoning, if that's what it was a slow-acting menace. He needed to get them out of the house and away from the poisoned water. He returned to the Miller home, the setting sun painting the sky in a final, defiant blaze of color. The house was even more foreboding in the twilight. He walked through the front door, no longer bothering with the formality of a knock. The air was even more suffocating than before, and the stench of decay was stronger. The family was in the living room, huddled together in a tight circle on the floor. Their skin was pale and waxy. Their eyes were red-rimmed and sunken. They were a family of living ghosts, consumed by their secret. Alistair knelt before them, the diary still clutched in his hand. "Elias," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I know everything. I read the diary. Old man Smith poisoned the well. He planned it. He knew you would take his land, and he used the well as a weapon." Elias looked at him, his face a mask of weary despair. "It's not poison, Doctor," he whispered, his voice a raspy imitation of its former self. "It's a curse. We took his land, and we sealed his secret. Now we are sealed with it." There is no curse, Elias. There is only a slow-acting toxin. You are suffering from a sickness, not a sin. The longer you stay here, the worse it will get. You have to leave. You have to tell the town what you did. It's the only way to be free. Alistair's words hung in the air, a desperate plea for reason in a world that had abandoned it. For a long moment there was silence. Then a low moan from Sarah, the mother. "He's right, Elias," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "He's right. The sounds, they're getting worse. I can't live like this." The boys, Jacob and Thomas, looked up at their father, their young faces filled with a desperate plea. Elias looked at his family, his eyes filled with a conflict between his deep-seated guilt and a flicker of hope. He was a man drowning in a sea of secrets, and Alistair's words were the only life raft in sight. "It started with the scratching," Elias said, his voice barely audible. "We thought it was rats, but it never stopped. Then the whispers. We tried to ignore them, but then they changed." "Changed?" Alistair asked. "They started to sound like our own voices," Elias confessed, a single tear rolling down his grimy cheek. "Saying things we had done, things we had said, our worst thoughts, our deepest secrets. They were all there, whispering from the walls." Alistair's mind raced. He had a new hypothesis. The poisoning, he reasoned, was causing a form of auditory hallucination. The guilt and fear of being discovered were manifesting as a physical symptom. The Miller family was not hearing voices from a supernatural being. They were hearing their own guilt, amplified and externalized by the poison. "We have to go," Alistair said, his voice firm and final. "Now, before it's too late." Elias looked at his family, his mind made up. He slowly stood, his body trembling with the effort. "We'll go," he said. "We'll tell them everything." Alistair felt a surge of relief. He had done it. He had broken through their delusion. He had saved them. But as they all stood ready to leave, a high-pitched shriek erupted from Eliza, the youngest. Her small body convulsed, her eyes rolling back in her head. A thin stream of blood trickled from her nose. "Eliza!" Sarah shrieked, rushing to her daughter's side. Alistair's medical training kicked in. This wasn't a seizure. This was something else. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak and thready. He realized with a terrible, chilling certainty that the toxin was reaching a critical level. It was a slow-acting poison, and it was about to claim its first victim. He had to get them out now. He grabbed Elias's arm. "Elias, we have to go. We can't wait." But just then, the front door swung open with a resounding crash. Elder Thomas and the deacon stood there, their faces grim and resolute. "What are you doing, Doctor?" the elder said, his voice a low growl. "You were told to leave." "I was helping them leave," Alistair replied, his voice a mix of defiance and fear. "They need medical help. They're dying." "They're under a possession," the elder said, his eyes filled with a fanatical glint. "And you, Doctor, are making it worse. You are a disbeliever. You have no right to interfere." Alistair's heart pounded in his chest. He was trapped. He looked at the family, their faces a mixture of terror and resignation. Elias had confessed, but it was too late. The town, in its blindness and superstition, had sealed their fate. The deacons advanced, their expressions a mixture of pity and resolve. Alistair knew he couldn't fight them. He had to use his words, his knowledge, to convince them of the terrible truth. "Look at them," he pleaded. "This is not a curse. This is a human act. Old Man Smith poisoned the well. If you don't believe me, test the water, but you have to let me help them." The elder looked at the Millers, his face a mask of conflict. He could see their suffering, but his faith, his community, his entire belief system was on the line. He chose the latter. "You have no proof," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. You have only the ravings of a madman's diary. Get out of my town, doctor, now." Alistair looked from the elder to the deacons, their faces grim and determined. He knew he was beaten. He took a final, desperate look at the Millers, a family consumed by a crime, a secret, and a town's unshakable superstition. He was a man of science, but he was no match for the collective ignorance of a religious community. He was forced to leave, his heart heavy with a terrible, silent defeat. He had solved the mystery, but he had failed to save the victims. As he walked out into the fading light, he heard the faint sound of a high-pitched wail from the house behind him. It was a sound he would never forget. Alistair walked out of Blackwood Creek, the fading light of the afternoon painting the world in a bruised palette of purples and grays. He didn't look back. The sound of Eliza's shriek, a final desperate cry for help, was a haunting echo in his mind. He was a man defeated, his professional confidence shattered. He had come to Blackwood Creek to prove the power of science, and in a way, he had. He had uncovered the truth. But that truth was powerless against the weight of a town's superstition. The journey back was a grueling one. The air, once so oppressive, now felt sharp and cold against his skin. He was no longer a detached observer. He was a participant in a terrible tragedy. He had come to save a family, and he had failed. He had discovered a crime, and he had been turned away. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the silent screams of the Millers. He spent the night in a small, dilapidated inn on the outskirts of a town called Hopewell. The innkeeper, a grizzled old man with a face like a dried apple, saw the haunted look in Alistair's eyes. "Bad journey, friend?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. Alistair didn't reply. He couldn't. He was a man of words, but he had no words for what he had seen. He sat by the fire, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey, trying to erase the images from his mind. The Millers, their faces contorted with fear and pain. The elder and the deacons, their faces hard with fanatical resolve. The diary, the well. The whole thing was a terrible, macabre puzzle, and he was the only one who had the pieces. He had to do something. He couldn't just walk away and let the Millers die. He was a man of science, but he was also a man of conscience. He had to go back. But he couldn't go back alone. They wouldn't listen to him. He needed proof, hard, irrefutable proof. He thought back to the old Smith farm, the well. He needed to get a sample of the water. He needed to get a chemist, a fellow man of science, to analyze it. He needed to get a lawman, a man of justice, to investigate the death of Old Man Smith. He had to expose the truth, not just for the Millers, but for the sake of the town, for the sake of justice. The next morning, he made a decision. He would not return to Nashville. He would go to Knoxville, a larger city with more resources. He would find a chemist and a police officer who would listen to him. The journey to Knoxville was long, but it was filled with a new purpose. The crushing guilt and defeat were replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He was no longer just a doctor, he was a detective, a man on a mission to right a terrible wrong. He arrived in Knoxville late in the afternoon. The city was a welcome change from the claustrophobic air of Blackwood Creek. There were people everywhere, and the noise and bustle were a comforting distraction. He found a respectable hotel and a hot meal. He felt a moment of normalcy, a brief respite from the horror he had witnessed. The next day, he went to the local police station. The chief of police, a burly man with a thick mustache named Chief Miller, listened to Alistair's story with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "A whole family suffering from a collective poisoning?" Chief Miller said, a look of disbelief on his face. "And the town is saying it's a possession? Sounds like a story from one of those penny dreadfuls, Doctor." "It's not a story, Chief," Alistair insisted, his voice urgent. "I have proof, a diary, and I can get a water sample from the well. The family, they're dying. You have to help me." Chief Miller looked at him, a glint of something in his eyes. He was a man of the law, and the murder of a man, even a recluse, was a crime he could not ignore. He looked at Alistair's face, at the exhaustion and the raw emotion in his eyes, and he knew he was telling the truth. "All right, Doctor," he said, a note of finality in his voice. "I'll help you. But you have to understand, we're going to a remote town, a place that doesn't want outsiders. We have to be careful." Alistair felt a surge of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. He had an ally, a man of law who was willing to listen to reason. He had a chance to save the Millers, to bring justice to a town that had turned a blind eye to a terrible crime. But as they prepared to leave, Alistair felt a creeping sense of unease. He had a plan. He had an ally. But he had been so focused on the physical crime that he had forgotten the psychological one. The Millers' fear, their guilt, their belief in a curse. What if the poisoning was just a symptom of a deeper, more profound psychological trauma? What if the curse wasn't in the water, but in the mind? He was a man of science, but he was entering a world where science had no answers. He was walking back into the heart of a darkness he had only just begun to understand. The return to Blackwood Creek was different this time. Alistair was not alone. He was accompanied by Chief Miller and 2 deputies. They were armed and resolute, a physical embodiment of the law that had been so conspicuously absent on his first visit. The journey was still long and arduous, but the presence of the others was a comforting balm against the ghosts of his previous trip. As they neared the town, a palpable tension settled over the group. The air grew still, and the oppressive silence of the mountains returned. When they arrived, the town was just as Alistair remembered, a collection of weathered shacks and a single imposing stone church. But this time, the silence was broken. A low murmur of voices, a mix of fear and anger, came from a small crowd gathered near the church. Elder Thomas stood at the front of the crowd, his face a mask of furious resolve. He saw Alistair and Chief Miller, and his eyes, usually so calm and pious, blazed with a righteous anger. "You have returned," he said, his voice a low growl. "And you bring with you the devil's agents." "These are not the devil's agents, Elder," Chief Miller said, his voice a calm, authoritative counterpoint to the elder's fanaticism. "These are officers of the law. We are here to investigate a crime, the death of Old Man Smith and the sickness of the Miller family." The crowd murmured, a low, ominous sound. They were loyal to the elder. They had bought into his story of a possession, of a divine punishment. To them, the law was a foreign entity, an unwanted intrusion. Alistair stepped forward, the diary of Old Man Smith in his hand. "Elder, I am not here to condemn you or this town. I am here to save a family. Look at them," he said, pointing towards the Miller home. "They are dying, not from a curse but from a poison. A poison that a man, in his final desperate act, used to take his revenge." Elder Thomas's eyes narrowed. "You have no proof, Doctor, only the lies of a man you call a scientist." "The proof is in the diary," Alistair said, holding it up. "The proof is in the well. I will take a water sample, and a chemist will prove that it is poisoned. And when I do, you will see that this is not a matter of faith, but a matter of human tragedy." Chief Miller stepped forward. "I will be taking a sample from the well," he said, his voice firm and final. "No one is to interfere." The deacons stepped forward, their faces grim and unyielding. The crowd began to close in, their faces a mixture of suspicion and anger. A standoff. Alistair looked at the faces around him and felt a chilling certainty. They were not just a town in denial. They were a town with a secret. The elder had to be hiding something. Something more than just an aversion to outside help. Suddenly a high-pitched guttural shriek erupted from the Miller house. The sound was so raw, so filled with a primal, agonizing pain that the crowd of townsfolk fell silent. It was a sound that was not human, a sound of pure, unadulterated torment. Alistair looked at the Miller house, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what that sound meant. The poison was taking its toll. The Millers were at their breaking point. He looked at Chief Miller. "We have to go, now." The chief, his face a mask of resolve, nodded. "Deputies, with me. The rest of you, stand down." But the deacons, spurred on by the elder, stood their ground. "This is a matter of God's will," one of them shouted. "You have no right to interfere." Alistair felt a surge of rage. He had come here to save lives, and he was being blocked by ignorance and superstition. He looked at the elder. "What are you so afraid of, elder? Why do you fear the truth?" Elder Thomas's face, once so pious and calm, now contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. "The truth is not yours to know, Doctor. The truth is in the house, and the darkness it brought with it." Alistair and the police officers, their hands on their holsters, pushed past the deacons. They ran to the Miller house, the terrifying shrieks echoing in the air. As they neared the front door, they could hear the sounds from within, a horrifying mix of moans, screams, and the constant low rhythmic sound of scratching. It was the sound of a family unraveling, piece by agonizing piece. When they entered, the scene was one of pure, unadulterated horror. The Miller family was a writhing mass on the floor, their bodies twisted and contorted in a horrifying, silent ballet of agony. Eliza, the youngest, was screaming, her small body convulsing violently. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, and a thin, dark liquid was leaking from the corners of her mouth. "My God," Chief Miller whispered, his face pale. Alistair knelt beside Eliza, his medical training taking over. But there was nothing he could do. This wasn't a case of a toxin. It was something else. The family was not just suffering from a poisoning. They were suffering from a collective psychological break. The poison had been the trigger, but the real enemy was the guilt, the fear, the isolation. The curse was not a supernatural one, it was a human one. The Millers were dying from their own secret. And then Alistair felt it. A faint, low humming. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not a physical sound. It was a vibration, a resonance that seemed to travel through the air, through the floorboards, through his very bones. It was the sound Old Man Smith had written about in his diary. The Millers were not just hallucinating, they were hearing something real, something that was driving them mad. The sound was a low, melodic hum, a soft, insidious rhythm that was slowly, methodically, and relentlessly destroying their minds. If you're captivated by the mystery of the Miller family, you can find the rest of this terrifying story by subscribing to the channel. Don't miss a single chapter of this chilling tale. This is a work of fiction. Alistair, Chief Miller, and the deputies stood in the Miller home, their faces a mixture of horror and confusion. The family's synchronized convulsions and the low, incessant hum that filled the room defied all rational explanation. Alistair's theory of a simple poisoning had fallen apart. The Millers were not just suffering from a physical malady, they were being tormented by something far more complex. "What is that sound?" Chief Miller whispered, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "It's what Old Man Smith wrote about," Alistair said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. He heard it too. "It's what drove him mad. It's not a curse. It's a physical phenomenon." He knew he sounded like a madman, but the evidence was right there, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to have a physical presence. He looked at the family, their bodies still, their eyes now empty, but their faces contorted in a silent, permanent scream. The humming was getting stronger, a low, bone-deep vibration that seemed to vibrate with their agony. Chief Miller, a man of the law, was out of his depth. He looked at Alistair, his face pale. "What do we do?" "We have to stop the sound," Alistair said, his mind working furiously. "I don't know what it is, but I know it's the cause of this. We have to find the source." He remembered Old Man Smith's diary entry. The sound came from the well. It was a well that was said to have healing properties. He had to find out why. He ran out of the house, the chief and the deputies following close behind. The crowd of townsfolk had dispersed, their fear and curiosity replaced by a profound and chilling silence. They reached the old Smith farm. The well stood in the middle of a clearing, a silent, moss-covered sentinel. The faint hum was stronger here, a constant low drone that seemed to thrum with a dark, ancient power. Alistair knelt, peering into the dark, unknown depths. "We need a light," he said. One of the deputies lowered a lantern into the well, the flickering light cutting through the darkness. The light revealed the water, a dark, murky liquid that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But it also revealed something else. Embedded in the walls of the well, far below the surface, were strange crystalline formations. They were a beautiful, shimmering blue, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive air of the well. They looked like natural rock, but they seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. Alistair's scientific mind worked furiously. These were not natural crystals. They were a form of piezoelectric quartz, a mineral that generates an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress. The well was a natural amplifier, and the stress of the earth, the seismic activity, the natural vibrations of the ground, were being amplified by the quartz, creating a low, incessant hum that was not just a sound, but a physical vibration. The Millers had built their home too close to the source of the vibration. The townspeople who lived farther away heard the hum as a faint whisper, but the Millers, who lived on the new land, were exposed to its full, unadulterated power. The family's psychological guilt and the constant vibrating stress of the hum had caused a collective psychological breakdown, a psychosis that manifested as seizures, hallucinations, and a profound, shared terror. "We have to destroy it," Alistair said, his voice urgent. "The crystals, they're causing the vibrations. We have to get them out." Chief Miller, a man of reason, understood the explanation. He looked at the deputies. "Go to the town. Get some dynamite. We're going to blow up the well." The deputies, their faces a mixture of relief and fear, hurried away. Alistair and Chief Miller stood by the well, the low, insidious hum now a constant presence in their ears. It was a sound that seemed to go beyond the sense of hearing. It was a feeling, a resonance that vibrated with their very souls. Alistair looked at the well, at the dark, pulsating crystals, and he felt a chilling certainty. This was not a curse. This was a form of psychological torture, a weapon of revenge more insidious than any poison. Old Man Smith, in his paranoid state, had known about the crystals. He had been driven mad by them. And in his final act, he had sealed his final revenge by ensuring the Millers would be exposed to the same fate. Suddenly, a loud crash, followed by the sound of furious shouting, came from the direction of the town. Alistair and Chief Miller looked at each other. They knew what it was. The deacons. They were coming back, and they were bringing the entire town with them. They were not just a town in denial, they were a town with a dangerous secret. The elder had lied. He had not just turned his back on Alistair. He had turned his back on the Millers, on the truth. He was a man with a secret, and he was not going to let Alistair reveal it. Alistair and Chief Miller returned to the center of Blackwood Creek. The town was in a state of chaos. The townsfolk, led by the elder and the deacons, were a furious chanting mob. They were holding torches and pitchforks, their faces a mixture of fear and fanaticism. "You have desecrated holy ground," Elder Thomas shouted, his voice a hoarse scream. "You are not here to save, but to damn." "I am here to save a family," Alistair said, his voice firm and defiant. "And I have discovered the truth. This is not a possession. This is a scientific phenomenon, a geological one. The well is not cursed. It is a natural amplifier for a low-frequency hum that is driving the Millers insane." The crowd scoffed. They didn't believe in science. They believed in God and the devil. Their faith was a shield against a reality they couldn't comprehend. "Show me the proof, Doctor," the elder snarled. "Show me the proof." Alistair's heart pounded in his chest. He had no choice. He had to show them. He had to convince them, even if it meant risking his life. "The proof is in the well that Old Man Smith knew about. He wrote about it in his diary. He was driven mad by it, and in his final desperate act, he decided to share his madness with the Millers." "Lies," the elder screamed. "You are the devil's agent sent here to turn us against our faith. The well has been here for a century. No one has ever been affected by it." Alistair looked at the faces of the townsfolk, at their blind faith and their unshakable fear. He knew he had to break through. He had to find a way to make them see the truth. He looked at the elder, a sudden chilling thought coming to him. The elder had been so determined to stop him, so resistant to a scientific explanation. Why? "Elder," Alistair said, his voice a low, commanding whisper. "You have been in charge of this town for a long time. You knew about Old Man Smith. You knew about his paranoia. You knew about his fight with the Millers, and you knew about the well." The elder's face, once so full of a righteous fury, now contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. "What are you talking about, Doctor?" "I am talking about the Millers' new plot of land," Alistair said, his eyes fixed on the elders. "The Millers had to sell their old land to buy the new one. And who bought their old land?" A chilling silence fell over the crowd. Alistair knew he had hit a nerve. The air grew thick with a terrible, unspoken truth. "You did, Elder," Alistair said, his voice quiet but full of a chilling certainty. "You bought their old land. They were a prosperous family, and when they fell, their land became available. You took advantage of their tragedy. You knew that the only way to get their land was to let their secret consume them. You knew that if they confessed to a crime, they would be shunned by the town. Their land would be seized, and you would be there to take it." The elder's face went white. He was a man exposed. His faith, his piety, his entire reputation was a lie. He was a man who had used a family's tragedy for his own gain. "This man is a liar," the elder screamed, his voice a high-pitched shriek. "He is an agent of the devil. He is trying to turn you against me." But it was too late. The townsfolk were murmuring, their faces filled with a sudden dawning horror. They had been blind, consumed by their superstition, and they had been led by a man who was using their faith for his own selfish gain. They had believed in a curse, but the real curse was their own blindness, their own ignorance. Alistair looked at the crowd. There is no possession, there is no curse. There is only a family consumed by guilt and a town that turned its back on them. You believed a lie, and you let a family suffer and die in your blindness. Suddenly, a loud crash erupted from the Miller home. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Alistair knew what had happened. He had been too late. The family had died, consumed by a psychological and physical torment that they had not deserved. The crowd of townsfolk looked at the Miller house, then at the elder, then at Alistair. Their faces were a mixture of regret, shame, and a terrible, chilling realization. They had been a party to a murder, not a miracle. Their superstition, their faith, had been a weapon in the hands of a man who had used it to destroy a family. Alistair stood in the center of the town, a man who had solved a mystery but had failed to save a family. He had exposed a crime, but the price had been paid in blood. The possession was not a supernatural entity, but a human one. It was the possession of a town by its own fear, its own ignorance, its own greed. And it was a possession that had left an entire family dead. The aftermath in Blackwood Creek was one of grim silence and profound shame. The bodies of the Miller family were found inside their home, their faces still locked in the silent scream of their final moments. Chief Miller and his deputies took the elder and the deacons into custody. The townspeople, their faith and their trust shattered, stood by in a stunned silence, watching as their leader, a man they had trusted, was led away in handcuffs. Alistair remained in Blackwood Creek for a few more days, a grim observer to the town's slow, painful healing. He oversaw the final analysis of the well water. The chemist confirmed his suspicions. The water was not poisoned with a conventional toxin. It contained microscopic particulate matter, a fine dust of the piezoelectric quartz. The constant ingestion of the dust, combined with the low-frequency hum that vibrated through the air, had created a neurotoxic effect that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and a profound collective psychosis. The possession was a physical and psychological reaction to an environmental stressor. The curse was a man-made one. The Millers had not been possessed by a demon. They had been consumed by a secret, a crime, and a shared psychological torment that was amplified by the very land they had coveted. Old Man Smith, in his final insane act of revenge, had found a way to create a living hell for the family that had taken his land. Alistair, his work in Blackwood Creek finished, prepared to leave. He was no longer a man of pure science. He had seen the power of superstition, the weight of guilt, and the dangerous intersection of human greed and natural phenomena. He had solved the case, but the victory was a hollow one. The family he had come to save was dead. The town he had come to help was shattered. As he was leaving, he was approached by Caleb, the Miller family's old hired hand. Caleb's face was a mask of grief and regret. "We could have helped them," he said, his voice low and raspy. "We could have stopped this." Alistair looked at him, his heart heavy with a silent truth. "You couldn't," he said. "The town's ignorance was too strong. The elders' greed was too powerful. The Millers' guilt was too heavy. It was a tragedy waiting to happen. It was a possession, not by a demon, but by a human failing." He left Blackwood Creek, the sun setting behind the mountains, casting long, mournful shadows over the land. He had come here to find the answer to a riddle, and he had found it. But the answer was more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. It was the story of a family consumed by a crime, a man driven mad by a natural phenomenon, and a town blinded by its own faith. It was a story of a possession, the most terrifying kind of possession. A human one. Alistair would go on to write about the case, a detailed report that would be scoffed at by his peers, who would call it a work of fiction. But Alistair knew the truth. He had seen it. He had heard it. He had felt the low, insidious hum of a terrible human darkness. He had seen a family fall victim not to a devil's curse, but to a human tragedy. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not a unique case. The human mind, with its capacity for both good and evil, its fragile hold on sanity, was capable of a darkness far more terrifying than any ghost or demon. He had come to Blackwood Creek to prove the power of science, but he left with a new, terrifying understanding of the power of the human mind and the secrets it was capable of hiding. If you're captivated by the mystery of the Miller family, you can find the rest of this terrifying story by subscribing to the channel. Don't miss a single chapter of this chilling tale. This is a work of fiction.